I also looked at the whole of our history, including the millennia we call prehistory. And that really whole systems approach made it possible to see connections between various key elements of social systems, social configurations that kept repeating themselves cross-culturally, transhistorically, connections that are otherwise invisible. And there were no names for these configurations. So I called one the domination system or the dominator system, and the other the partnership system. And identifying these configurations made it possible to answer the questions of my childhood with a resounding yes. There is a social alternative. However, we cannot see that alternative as long as we're stuck in our conventional social categories, categories that a colleague of mine calls weapons of mass distraction. Why? Because they fragment our consciousness. And it's really simple. As Einstein said, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. We need new thinking. And this new thinking requires paying close attention to matters that we have been taught to marginalize, but which are key. Yes, and empowering women, reinstating the, quote, feminine into our guiding system of values, and changing the normative definition of power. Because the problem is not power, but power as defined and exercised in domination systems. I'm best known for a book called The Chalice and the Blade. And the blade is a symbol of power in domination systems. It is the power to control, to dominate, really the power backed up by fear or force. But there is another form of power that isn't just the power to control, to dominate, to take life, but a form of power that's appropriate for as we move more towards partnership systems. And that's the power symbolized by the chalice, the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life, power with, and yes, power to, our creative power, which is enormous. If you think about it, just about everything around us is a human creation, not just the physical objects, but yes, the norms, the beliefs, the institutions. What you can see is modern history is not, just as we're taught in our schools, a random collection of events, that actually what it consists of is a strong movement towards the partnership side of the partnership domination continuum, countered, yes, by enormous domination resistance and punctured by periodic regressions, just like we're experiencing now in the world, towards the domination side. Because look, what we see is something that is very, very important to know, which is that all the modern progressive movements have actually challenged the same thing. They've challenged a tradition of domination. Think about it. The Enlightenment so-called rights of man movement challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule over their quote subjects, right? The anti-slavery and later the civil rights, anti-colonial, Black Lives Matter movements challenged again the divinely ordained right of a supposedly superior race to rule over, quote, inferior ones. The feminist and now today the women's rights and also the men's movement. It's challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the quote castles of their homes, a military metaphor, all the way to the environmental movement, which challenges, again, another tradition of domination, our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, which at our level of technological development and population could take us to an evolutionary dead end as a species. But if you look more closely, and I really invite you to join me, again, not just in leaving old ways of thinking behind, but also to look at what's been happening. If you look more closely using the partnership domination social scale, we see that these movements primarily focus their resources, their energy on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid. We need new language, especially new social and economic categories, which are whole systems categories. And yes, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy. It is partnership, which is an inclusive term. And this is vital because linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories that are provided by a culture's language, they channel our thinking. So it's very difficult, it's almost impossible to image other alternatives.
And as we come to the global north, or we come in contact with the West, we suddenly become translators of two cultures between East and West. We have to explain ourselves. We have to explain what it is that we are, what is it that we are not. And we have to be okay with this misunderstanding of who we are as women, as Arab-speaking women, and as non-veiled women. And also, again, being the witness of a lot of racism and of anti-Arab sentiment, and a lot of what we call also the justification of our erasure, because the land that we occupy is a very strategic land for the global north. It's strategic for its access to oil, access to gas, access to gold, access to resources. It's very strategic as well for the control of that region. With occupied Palestine, with what's happening in Yemen, with what's happening in Syria. And so our region is extremely occupied in a way by the West, and it is justified as so. It is for the well-being of the West. It's for the access to all of these resources. So again, our bodies, the extension of our bodies is the land. And especially as we're talking about women's bodies, we're talking about the occupation of our lands and the misunderstanding of who we are, of our cultures. And so under colonialism, women's bodies become geographies of control and oppression. And as I was saying earlier, we live in contradiction. We live in the contradiction between modesty and our sexual emancipation, between provocation and religion, between faith and dogma, between freedom and oppression, between our own honor versus the honor of our families. And so in this way, we occupy a sort of impossible place. And this impossible place is very hard to define. And in the way that the media is sort of morphing and changing into this idea of superficial inclusion, we have to perform our identity in order to be understood by the West. We have to perform our culture. We have to become the sort of ambassadors of the entire human rights of our nations, because otherwise, we will just continue justifying oppression over everyone in our countries and in our cultures, in our lineage. And so with this, I just want to just ask the public to just think a little bit about your perception of the Arab world or the Middle East, or Arab women or Muslim women, and just what you've heard throughout your life about these prejudices that are being said about us the sort of education that we are getting is an education where we are deeply understanding the West. The West is occupying our region. So we must understand it. We must speak its language, right? Like we first speak English, we speak French, and we also speak Arabic. And some of us also continue to uphold and speak our ancient traditional languages. But we first and foremost, we learn the language of the West. And with that, we have a deeper understanding of the West. But I want to ask how the West understands us, not speaking our language and not understanding our culture. In our translations of one another, there is a group that deeply understands the other and another group that deeply misunderstands the other. And that is just the norm, and that is accepted. And there is a level of ignorance that is cushioned and nurtured and is acceptable. And I think that's oppression, that is a form of oppression that I would like to address, because when we are going to be talking about the media, we absolutely need to be discussing this layer of misunderstanding that exists, and that is acceptable. It's very important for me to say something about power, because I don't think we are allowed as women of color, women of the global majority, to even play with power, to understand power. First of all, we are socialized and politicized under a very oppressive imbalance of power, where we are disempowered and we are not invited to own power. And so we have a very conflicted relationship with power, contradictory relationship with power. And power represents something that is almost something that we fought our entire life. So how do we want it? Like, what does it look like when it's for us? And when a woman is empowered in her power, living her true identity, her true self, or their true self, their true identity, their calling, that may intimidate a lot of people, and that power may be misunderstood as well, right? That power may be judged. And there is something we don't talk often about in any space, is the success of women of color, women of the global majority. Their success is completely misunderstood. And their success is also scrutinized. And I know, because I am being scrutinized all the time. How come she knows all this? Or how come she was writing a book? Or how come you're speaking about this? And where did you study this? And how many years did you study this? And the questions that are not asked to white women. And I'm just saying that because, like, the idea of power is something that also we have to meditate with. How does it feel inside of our body to be empowered? What does it look like to be empowered? And if someone next to you is deeply empowered, does that threaten you? Does that create jealousy inside of you? Because the more and more I surround myself with women who are deeply in their power, most of the time we talk about the hate we receive, the jealousy that is surrounding us, the lack of support that we get. I feel like we're all digesting this information, we're all like meditating together. Mm. I think the invitation mostly is to, there's no right or wrong, or, of course there's right and wrong in the grand scheme of things, but as we are exploring this collective liberation process of being together, being empowered, being, all of that, the invitation is to experiment and to innovate. So we have to start somewhere. And again, it starts with all the things that we discussed about feeling comfortable with discomfort, addressing power within yourself. What does that feel like to feel free? These meditations are important.